All right, guys, I told you this one was coming. I told you it was coming. Today, we have none other than Drew from Whisky Lore Podcast, and he wrote a book. Well, he wrote a number of books, but he wrote a book that we are doing a book club over, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey. We're going to get into everything about this book, which it's a lengthy book, so we're not going to get into everything about it, but we are going to get into this. We're going to get into Drew's background, all the things that he's doing, and we're actually going to share a little dram together. We were talking beforehand about something we could do, and I said, hey, let's do a Tennessee whiskey. So we're gonna sip a Tennessee whiskey as well. But I want to thank Drew so much for coming on here. So without further ado, here he is.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Randall. I appreciate the welcome, and it's great to see people absorbing this 400-page epic book that I wrote that was supposed to be 150 pages. I thought, there's not that much Tennessee whiskey history. I mean, I just want to get something out there because I would go on tours in Tennessee, and it was funny because every tour I was going on, I was having people tell me Jack Daniel's history, and I'm like, okay, Jack Daniel's couldn't have been the only one making whiskey in Tennessee, right. But I mean, it wasn't until I got to Lost State Distillery in Bristol where they had a whiskey called Shelby's Reserve, and I went, Shelby's Reserve, what's that all about? It's got kind of a 19th or 18th century label on it, and they said, Evan Shelby, the first Tennessee distiller, and I went, ooh, there's some stories here that haven't been told. I need to go figure out what this is all about. So, yeah, I mean, for a guy who's never really written a history book before, this was a great undertaking. And seriously, if I'd have thought that it was going to be a 400-page book when I started it, I probably wouldn't have started it, because I would have thought, there's no way I could write something like that.
I totally understand, but I can tell you guys, and we're going to get into it. This is a precursor or a postcursor of the book club that we're doing. And one of the things I wanted to say is the way that, of course, I have the book, the physical copy in my hand, but I'm also listening to it on Audible, and you actually narrate it on Audible. And I will say, and I'm not trying to toot your horn, you have the voice of someone that, like, I just want to sit in the truck. I'm supposed to be working, I just want to sit in the truck and listen, because like there's so much information cram packed in this book, and there's dates and people and all of these things where, like, I'm going to have to re-listen, or I'm going to have to take notes. I'm going to have to do, you're making it very hard for me, which I love. I love that. I love being challenged, but at the same time, it's really cool to see the amount of time and money and energy that you put into getting this book out there. And we're going to talk about a lot of your other books as well. So before we get too far in the weeds, we had both talked about pouring a whiskey, and I just so happen to have, if I can get it out, the new batch 4 or whatever it was of the Jack Daniel's 10. And you said, did you happen to have a sample of it? So I thought, hey, if we're gonna talk about Tennessee whiskey, we might as well drink one. I haven't even sampled this. So I'm really interested to get into it. I told you a little bit off camera that I'm fairly new to liking Tennessee whiskey. So I'm intrigued about it, and I want to learn more about Tennessee, and that's why we picked up this book. We, as in me, why I picked up this book, and I thought, hey, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to deep dive this book, I want people, my listeners, to follow along, and hopefully it's well received. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe any of your socials or anything where somebody can find you.
Okay. Well, writing books wasn't where I started. I actually worked as a web designer and still own my web design company. So that's how I afford to travel around all the different places that I go to. And so at one point around 2016, I was like, the business is kind of running itself for the most part. I had people doing programming for me. So I thought, I'd love to do something a little different with life. What am I not doing with my life that I'd like to do? And that was travel. So I started traveling all over Europe. And one year, in fact, 2019, I went to Hawaii in January. I went to Cancun in February. Then I went to North Dakota a couple of months later, because that was the 50th state that I was going to hit. So I decided to go to Manitoba, because that was going to be the 10th and final province in Canada for me to. So that's kind of where I was at. I started a podcast called Travel Fuels Life. And what I was doing was I was trying to teach other people how to be able to live a travel lifestyle the way that I was. Well, one of the trips that I took was a trip where I had gotten some miles for building out my office. And I was like, okay, I'm going to use these airline miles to go to Paris. I've learned French in high school. Maybe this is my chance to figure this out and see if I can converse with people. And so I took off for I was going to take off for that trip, but then I was like, you are not the type of traveler that likes to stay in one place for too long. So why don't you rent a car and then plan a trip out around it? And I was deep into James Bond at the time. So I went back and watched all the James Bond movies and figured out where all the locations were for the movies. And then I planned a trip through Europe going to all of these different locations. So kind of a theme trip to do. Wow. Which was amazing. Yeah, that was fun. So when I came back home, I was like, okay, well, I want to do another theme trip because that was successful and people enjoyed it. And so where could I go next? And I, like you, had not had a very good experience with Jack Daniels when I was younger. And because of that, I had not had whiskey for 20 years. And I just was not interested. I was drinking. To this day, honestly, if somebody says take a shot of whiskey, I'm like, not unless you want it right back on you, bud.
Right.
Because drinking and consuming too fast, which is probably not a bad issue to have, right, creates the gag reflex. It's not good. So just the smell of whiskey, actually, and mostly bourbon, Jack Daniels, anything like that was going to bother me. So I decided, a friend decided that since I was getting interested in trying something besides beer, I should get into whiskey, but I should try scotch first.
Yes.
So we moved into drinking scotches, and I found that my palate started coming around to scotches, and I was enjoying it. And we were doing little clubs together, or little gatherings, and we'd talk about whiskey, and I couldn't really taste anything specific, but until we got to that Isla whiskey, and then I'm like, okay, I know that's a Band-Aid.
Yes.
That's definitely a Band-Aid.
Absolutely.
But that was the only one I could get. Other than that, everything bourbon just tasted like bourbon. So, and then my friends and I were all sitting around chatting about stuff, and I knew my BS meter was up because I was thinking, these guys are talking like they know what bourbon is. Limestone filtered water made in Kentucky. But this doesn't sound right. I need to go figure this out for myself. So my next theme trip was to go to Kentucky. And so I did planned out a 19 distillery 8-day tour of Kentucky that included Jack Daniels and George Dickel on the way home. I live in South Carolina. So I decided to video blog the whole thing from beginning to end. And so what were my experiences after I left each distillery? What was I thinking as I went into each distillery? And it was great because at the beginning I was like, I'm going to Maker's Mark. I know nothing. And by the end, I'm at Jack Daniels going, wow, this Jack Daniels place is pretty impressive. I guess I really shouldn't have been downing it all these years because of my stupidity of drinking too fast or whatever it may be. So, so it was definitely eye-opening, but I was still just doing my Travel Fuels Life podcast. And it was at a podcast convention in Orlando that I met someone who said, if you can teach somebody something, you should write a book. And so I thought, well, I have all the material already. I've done all this travel around Kentucky. I might as well, work on a book on how to do the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
Right.
And I had already been to 17 on that trip. So I was like, I'll just go see another 17 and then I will write a book about it and I'll do profiles on them and all the rest. And amazingly enough, I actually went through with it. Never think I'd probably ever write a book. And there it was, my travel guide, experiencing Kentucky bourbon. And it's done really well. I mean, 150 plus 5-star reviews on Amazon. It's been out for 5 years. And the only reason I didn't want to do a follow-up to it was because the KDA had come up with a field guide, the Kentucky Distillers Association. And it was like, okay, they have a little guide. They're selling it. and that's fine. We'll roll with that. Well, they decided not to do that anymore. So and then my book starts selling again. And I'm like, okay, this is not good because these are 5-year-old profiles pre-pandemic. Everything has changed. There's more distilleries. Some of the distilleries that I just put addresses for, I really needed to cover, like Green River, which was OZ Tyler at the time that I went the first time. So I have just completed and just launched the second edition, which has gone from 150 pages to 250 pages with 84 different either distilleries, micro distilleries, tasting rooms, barreling experiences. So it is definitely expanded in that way. Plus, in the meantime, I've been writing history books. So it was like, okay, I was embarrassed because I read the history that I wrote in the first Experience in Kentucky Bourbon book. And I'm like, this thing is still selling. And all of that is just marketing garbage. None of it is, almost none of this is true. It's all stuff I learned on these tours, and I got to fix it. It's not right. And so the new edition, I actually go through and not only do I rewrite the history of Kentucky bourbon in a way that people have probably never heard it before, but I'm also took all those little bits of lore that I had in my first edition and put them as a bonus part after that to say, here's where I went wrong, and here's why this piece of lore is not true, and here's why this piece of lore isn't true. So that's why I call it Whiskey Lore. I had actually, after that tour around Kentucky, and then after writing the book, or as I was writing the book, I started doing a podcast called Whiskey Lore, where I was debunking whiskey myths. And so I was doing a lot of research. I thought I was doing a great job, but it wasn't until I started working on this Lost History of Tennessee whiskey book that I realized that my research skills were not that good back then, and that a lot of those would have to be re-researched because you can't trust what you read on the internet, which I already sort of knew. But it's I do find sources on the internet, but it's usually newspapers.com, or it's old books that you may have some more firsthand knowledge of particular things. But modern whiskey books, I hate to say it for people who've read a lot of them, but for me, they're not reliable because most of them don't have footnotes in the back of them. They are basically taking a lot of oral tradition, and they're taking a lot of stuff that was written in books that were written before them that didn't do a lot of research. And so it just becomes a perpetuation of all of these myths. And so, I had to change. And that's when I said, I'm not doing the Whiskey Lore podcast anymore as a history podcast. I will write history books. And so that's why I released a book called Whiskey Lore Volume 1, which is me dispelling 24 whiskey myths in my storytelling style, like I did on the Whiskey Lore podcast and like I do in the Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey. If you like that writing style, that is basically what the podcast was, and the way that I write history, because to me, history is stories, and stories is what makes history interesting.
Well, and also just to caveat in that, and also that's what makes whiskey interesting, right? It's the story. Right. And so it's really cool that you went back on the book that you had already written and was like, yeah, that's crap. I can't do that anymore. I'm sorry. Yeah. I gotta right these wrongs or whatever, and it's super cool that you do that, because a lot of authors, they're just like, put it out, print it, it's fine, and then we'll worry about it on the next series or whatever, and I'll defame myself later. It's not that big of a deal. But you were adamant about it, and you were like, hey, no, we're gonna change these things. But you left them in there, and you've kind of debunked them like you do. You kind of just said, hey, this is what they said, but this is not true because of X. And it's just really cool that you're able to do that. Now, how often do you get pushback from the distilleries that you're trying to deep dive?
You would be surprised. I have not really seen any pushback at all. Now, I always do kind of go into this with first of all, it's very hard to dispute the facts. So, there's 600 footnotes in that book. So if, I write about Jack Daniels in there, and I know there are things that Jack Daniels has probably read in that book that go, oh man, I mean, there's certain things we've said that maybe aren't quite, but what I find is that this you don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. You let that story roll on because people enjoy the stories. They want to hear the stories. And that's a marketing department's job.
Yes.
I mean, the marketing department, this is where we have to separate history from marketing. If I wanted to try to keep every marketing department staying strict to history, I would probably die of an ulcer very early in my life because that's just not their job. And the reason I understand that is because I've worked in web design for many years. Before that, I worked in the marketing department. I was the art director. I had to do all of this kind of, sell it to somebody. And I get that their job is not an easy job to do. And it's probably not fun having somebody like me come along and go, those stories you've been telling are not quite right. But I don't take offense to it. And I understand that that's going to be there. What I love, though, is when I go to a distillery, which when I went and redid the visits I went to 35 distilleries in 11 days in Kentucky to do the revamp on this. Now, I already knew a lot of this stuff. So I was just seeing, what are they tasting now? What are, what are some changes to the tours, that sort of thing. But I had multiple, I went in February, which is a great time to go if you want to be alone with a tour guide going through the distillery and seeing some things you're not normally going to see. Because most of the tours I went on just me and the tour guide.
Awesome.
And so we got into discussions, and I was very heartened to hear a lot of these tour guides going, man, I love that. No, I need to know that story. I need to know that story. I'd like to incorporate that into my storytelling. When you go to Castle and Key and I'm telling things about E.H. Taylor that are very different from what the general knowledge of E.H. Taylor is that's been put out by Buffalo Trace, they hear that and they go, oh, wow, that's kind of interesting. It gives a whole different side to this guy. My favorite one being that when I was doing the research, and I don't know if you've gotten this far in the book yet, for Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, I stumbled into this story where I was trying to research about the Bottled in Bond Act because I thought I had stumbled into an article in an old newspaper that was actually giving some credit for the Bottled in Bond Act to a Tennessee representative. So I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. Let me go track this down. Well, I never could find that article again. I don't know what happened to that article, so I can't hold that as being anywhere near truth, but it did get me digging deeper. And I actually pulled up the end of the year Internal Revenue records. Now, the Internal Revenue Service is who was basically over whiskey before Prohibition. And so the head of the Internal Revenue, the commissioner of the Internal Revenue, in his year-end report in 1895 said, Hiram Walker, the Canadian brand, is kicking our tail in the export market with Canadian Club because they have an export bonding act. We need an export bonding act to be able to compete with them. Now, of course, the story I wrote in my Whiskey Lore episode number 4, season 1 on Bottled and Bond was giving all the credit to E.H. Taylor because that's what we're told. E.H. Taylor, some say he lobbied for it. Some say he wrote the bill. I mean, it goes as deep as you want it to go. The reality is, no, it was Canadian Club that was kicking our tail in the export market that caused the Internal Revenue Commissioner to reach out to a guy named Walter Evans, who used to be the head of the Internal Revenue, but was now a Kentucky representative, to write a bill to create a bonding act. Now, I'm looking all over the place to find where Colonel Taylor falls into the story, but he's too busy suing everybody in Kentucky who has the last name Taylor. Right. So that is associating with whiskey. So he's nowhere to be found. And so as I start really digging deep into the story, trying to figure it out, I'm like, where does this narrative come along that it was to save Kentucky bourbon or that it was about adulterating whiskey? And what happened was, it actually evolved because a guy named Isaac Wolf Bernheim was going from Kentucky. He owned a wholesale business with his brother they ended up going to Washington, D.C. to try to kill the Bottling Act, which was what it was called as it was going through Congress, because they thought that it was going to hurt their business because they didn't distill whiskey. And this was to save taxes and bottling to send directly from the distillery overseas without paying double taxation. Well, when he got involved and the bill started to drag, all of a sudden they needed to figure out another angle to get this thing on the docket. And what was the angle? Well, there's, adulteration of food, and there's, this is to protect the quality of our spirit. And so it slowly turned into a battle for something that was going to, get all of this bad whiskey off the market.
Mm.
So Taylor does end up in the story, but where does he end up on the tail end? After it passes, no one is taking advantage of it. And in fact, it was frustrating, the Internal Revenue. They're like, we did all this work to get this thing passed, and now nobody's actually taking advantage of it. And then E.H. Taylor, who was a huge proponent of the pot still, he said, whiskey was the best it's ever been in 1812, and you can't make it any better than that. That was his opinion. Would always market the pot still, but maybe the pot still was getting a little harder to sell in an age when everybody was going to a column still. So he picked up on bottled and bond. He sent a massive shipment of bonded whiskey to Chicago, and that kicked off the push for bottled and bond. He was a big proponent of it. He had nothing to do with the creation of it. So, and then you're at Castle and Key and you're listening to them tell the story, and they're telling the other story.
Right.
And so it's kind of fun to, toss it out there and say, well, now that you've done your whole spiel, this is what I learned. And then, hopefully someday they'll change the story, because I think the actual story is kind of fun in and of itself. And it gives Castle and Key a different story to tell versus Buffalo Trace, who's entrenched themselves in the E.H. Taylor story because they have the E.H. Taylor label.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story, So
Right.
It's like they're just living off of this myth, or what the mythos of that. And it's really cool that you don't have a problem just saying, hey, but this is what actually happened from all of this literature that I've done research on. And it's all publications of newspapers and things like that, which, yes, they could be fabricated or whatever, but more than likely they're going to be truthful. I would say they would be fairly true. Have you ran into anything in publication, and this might be a very broad term, but in publication where you're like, that's not true?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Well, the first thing is that the first layer of this is you have the wets and the dries. So pre-prohibition, you had two different stories going on. The way you have right and left in newspapers these days, well, you had right and left back then too, but then you introduced this wet and dry, and some Democrats were, more wet than others, and most Republicans were pretty dry, but there were a few wet ones around. So this new angle started to be created, and you would listen to these guys just make stuff up back and forth. And you have to read a lot of it. To write this Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey book, I had to immerse myself for almost 6 months in reading nothing but 1800s newspapers just to get into the mindset of what these people were, how they were thinking, because too many authors, I think, tend to write history from a modern perspective. And they think that because we market now, they would have been marketing back then, or that marketing was a very important part of what they did. There were people like Jack Daniel who were pretty much the foundation of kind of this over bloviated, myth telling in marketing. A lot of that started in the late 19th century. Before that, there wasn't a lot of marketing. It was basically, what product are you putting out? Where did it come from? That was the most important thing to know, because you wanted to trust that your whiskey was coming from a reliable source, but it was still being shipped in barrels. bottles didn't come along really. I mean, people would carry a flask with them, a glass flask, but everything was being blown. The glass was being blown. So they couldn't blow these big bottles like we have today. It was as much lung capacity as you had as to how big the bottle was going to be. And it drives me nuts every time I'm watching the History Channel and I'm watching a series on Ulysses S. Grant, and he's there, Civil War, 1863, sitting back, and he's got a bottle of Old Crow next to him with a label on it. And I go, there's no labels. They didn't have labels. What are you doing with labels? And next of all, Old Crow wasn't even making it to that area yet. Give me a break, you know? So that's the funny thing about all of this, is that once you kind of learn it, your antenna goes up for things like, is that really true, or is that not true? And I will say, I never write any book with the idea that I have found all the answers, or that sometimes my speculation ends up being off. Like, for instance, in my Whiskey Lore Volume 1 book, I go in and I talk about the history of the master distiller. And to my searches, I could not find a mention of anyone named master distiller until the early 20th century. And then when I did find it, it was always saying that these are masters of distilling rather than that it's a job title. And that the job title didn't really come along until 1970s, 1980s, a little bit after that. And then there's a woman, Laura Fields, who has a Facebook page, and she posts all sorts of, she's a historian in Pennsylvania. And it's fun to work with her because she's very sort of not anti-Kentucky, but she's like, Pennsylvania has a story and you need to tell this story. So she's sometimes a little Pennsylvania friendly. But I will say that the thing about what she does is that she is great at finding things that I can't find. And so she found census records from, I guess, around the 1860s, where two people were mentioned in their occupation as master distillers. So the title was there. So I always tell people at the end of every history book, I say, look, if you can find the answer, find it. I want you to prove me wrong. If you can prove me wrong, that makes history better. It is a kick to the ego at the beginning. Right. But there's that thing inside of me that says, you know, honestly, some of this stuff, like when I started writing the Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey book, the idea behind that book was to get a starting point for learning about Tennessee whiskey history, not that this was going to be the be all and end all. Now, of course, I got a little radical and kept writing and researching, so it got a little thicker than I wanted it to. But still, every one of those stories that I run across there, every name that I come up with, there is a deeper story behind them. And whether we actually find it or don't find it, I want to put the name out there so that there's a chance we can find it. And if somebody can tell a deeper story, I tell the story of Nancy Patterson in this book, and I don't know if you've gotten to that part yet.
No, not yet.
Okay. I don't know if I want to spoil it for you because it's kind of
it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The thing is, we hear all this, you know, who was the first female master distiller? Who was the first master distiller? All these kind of questions. And so what happens is we kind of put a stop point when we say, you know, this person in the 21st century was the first female master distiller. And I'm thinking, you know, for years, nobody's really been looking any deeper behind that. It's just like, okay, the statement's made, end of record, we're on to the next thing. Now, there have been women in distilling since the beginning.
Absolutely.
And so you're really, yes, it was, you know, these time periods, earlier time periods were probably more difficult for women in terms of getting a leadership position. But there were women like Nelson's Greenbrier, Louisa Nelson ran that distillery, Josephine Brown in the famous, at that time, Robertson County, Tennessee. They were the last two female distillers in that, or they were the last two distillers in legendary Robertson County. They kept their distilleries running all the way to the end. So I'm going, there's got to be more to this. And there's a woman named Carol Roberts, and she had come out with a book not long before I came out with mine. And she had found some amazing information about a woman who was actually a ex enslaved woman who married an Irishman, and when he died, she took over his distillery, and she had actually been the head distiller. So they called her the boss distiller. And the reason we know all this stuff about her, and she ran it for 30 years or so.
Wow.
Yeah. And so this story comes in the late 19th century. It's the only reason that she stopped distilling at 90 or 85 or whatever she was because Prohibition hit Tennessee in 1909, and that was the end of distilling.
Right.
But nobody really knew that story, because what's the use of looking for these stories if we already know who so this is my big thing about, we got to keep challenging history, and we can't be so adamant that this person was the first or that this story is the truth and that we can't dig any deeper into it, because what I find is every time I think I got the story right, I bump into an article that makes me go, oh, maybe I should rethink that. So
that's so amazing that, the history inside the history, or the history outside of the history that and it's really cool to see you, especially deep diving one section of one piece of one thing, just being like, there has to be more to this part, not the whole story, just this one thing. And then finding, praise God for all the people that you work with as well. All the people in the newspapers and stuff like that, helping you along your journey, because it takes a village to write a book, right? I mean, I've never done it, but I'm sure it's not something you can just do of your own, of your own brain, just thinking, because like you said, not everything that comes to print is truthful. So it's doing that research and using other references and being like, do these 2 or 3 references go together? Yeah, they all seem to line up. And it just makes me think, like, just having this book and the pages that are in it, how many hours of time that you and your colleagues worked on one paragraph or one thing, just to get, because like when it comes to history, a lot of old history, especially, it got lost, it got destroyed, it got changed because they didn't want people to know about it. And it's like, you're actually trying to find that. So I'm going to ask a question, and if you can't tell me, that's fine. But like, what are some of your, obviously you've said newspapers and stuff like that, but what are some of your resources that you go to? Because like, I will tell you, the first, I'm in chapter, I don't even know at this point, 14, 15, whatever. By the time this episode comes out, I'll be done with the book. So guys, just stop.
Yeah.
It's hard for me. I have ADHD, and I get, it like, I got to read it. Sometimes I have to listen to the same paragraph over again. Anyway, so how do you, doing your research, like how it has to be taxing, getting all of that stuff from the microfiche that you're watching or whatever, or looking at, into written word. Like I guess kind of walk us through that part, because I know for me, I hear history and I know all of these things, and people tell me these things, and I listen to people like you that are I would say more knowledgeable than I about it. And I'm like, okay, but as you well said, like, you don't take anybody's, that's not the gospel, right? You have to do your own research on that. So like, yeah, I don't know. How do you go about putting all this on paper, I guess?
Well, it's fresh in my mind because I'm doing it again. I'm working on a book that will be very similar to this one, on the history of Bourbon County and its relationship to bourbon whiskey. And the way that you write a book like this is you draw an outline and you say, what are the different subjects that I want to cover? You try to put them in a logical order and you have to not get married to that order, because you're probably going to end up changing it because something will come along to upset the apple cart. So I tend to first do all of my initial research in just collecting and organizing within a Word document, and just like, let me get it all in there. Let me put all the footnotes with it. Let me know where I got this source from, where I got this source from. And then after I get, for this, I had 700 pages worth of notes. I read through the 700 pages of notes, and I try to see where stories are. I try to see where there are common themes. And what's amazing to me is that I will jump in and find a story. And then as I start to write that story, I will realize that it connects to a story that I had much earlier in the writing, or might connect to a story I have much earlier in the writing,
Right.
which sends me back to research. So in the case of, it's hard for me. Tennessee's not that far away from me. I mean, I can get to the state archives in Tennessee in probably 5 hours.
Okay.
I didn't realize how much information there was at the state archives, because I probably would have just gone to Nashville a lot more than just going to all of these small little county archive offices. But I spent a lot of time in the Moore County, Lincoln County, and Coffee County archives digging through title deeds, just trying to find names of distillers. So this is how I've learned all the names of bourbon distillers in Bourbon County on my current research, because the way you do it is I basically came up with a short list of names. Just found a book. Actually, there's a really good book, and he just passed away. His son, he and his son came up with Jefferson's brand, but Chet Zoller, he did an amazing job with this book. Now I have an older edition, but he has every distillery, a little history on all of the historic Kentucky distilleries. So I'll go back and I'll plug through that book every once in a while to see if I can find particular names. But he's only got so many Bourbon County distillers in there.
Right.
But it gives me a skeleton. Now I know the big names. Now I need to find the small names. So you just start going through the Bourbon County title deed records, and you start looking for title deeds that are associated with the word distillery. Now you're starting to pull in some more names. And you go to the Historic Society and you say, okay, what do you have? Oh, we have this map. And this map was drawn by somebody in 1912 who their grandmother told them where all these things were. And then it has all these different distillers' names all around it. And you go, okay, now a bigger picture is starting to evolve. Now I'm going to start asking some people, maybe get a little bit of additional information. I'm going to dive in and do some more research. What most people do when they research these kinds of books, as I see it, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems to be what I find, is that when people are writing whiskey history books, they go find a stack of older whiskey history books. They pull a lot of the stuff out of those older history books, and then they will go and talk to somebody. And they'll say, what did your great grandfather do? And do you have some old family Bibles? And what kind of family records do you have? And so they're going to give you all of this information. And while I wish I could do that, I know what human nature is. And human nature is to embellish your story, embellish your family standing and what you're doing. And I can sniff out a book that is written on oral tradition pretty quickly, because there won't be many footnotes. They'll be in the back. It'll acknowledge family members. A perfect example of that is the book that's written on Jack Daniel from 1967. It was a guy named Ben Green. He was a newspaper reporter at the Bedford County newspaper. And he had gone to Jack Daniels in the height of when it was on allocation, and there was just this mystique around it. And you had Frank Sinatra talking about it, and Jackie Gleason talking about it. And, everybody wanted it. It was the only brown spirit anywhere in the world that seemed to have any kind of interest in it. Everybody else was falling down. And he had a great opportunity to write a fantastic book, because some of those people were still alive. Some of the people that knew Jack Daniel were still alive. And so he talked to a lot of those people. And unfortunately, what came out of that is kind of a Hollywoodized version of Jack Daniel's life. And why? Well, because it's the easiest way to write a book. If you can, at the very beginning of the book, say, this is historical fiction, I could only find so much information, there are facts in this book, then yeah, it's much easier, a much easier approach to writing, and you can get very creative on what you're writing. The problem is that it doesn't advance history at all. And the other issue with that is that it creates, well, I think in a way it weakens the person that's being talked about, because you're not, you're basically saying this person was important, but not important enough for me to tell their real story and say that there were limitations in what I could tell. I'm not going to make stuff up. I'm going to give you the real story, but I'm going to tell you as much of the real story as I can. And so when you read in my book about Jack Daniel's life, you're going to read a very different story than you're going to read in Jack Daniel's legacy, because I didn't talk to those family members. I didn't get kind of that, he had so many girlfriends, he couldn't swat them away. That's great, fine, whatever. But, who was the real guy? What was he doing? So one of my favorite stories about Jack Daniel that never gets told, that I bumped into, that goes back to this oldest registered distillery claim that they make, which is obviously not correct. And the reason it's obviously not correct is because I went to the Internal Revenue, I went into the Internal Revenue books in the National Archives in Atlanta, and I dug through books from 1868 to 1873. And first of all, nobody was distilling in Tennessee at that time, believe it or not. The reason they weren't distilling, I kept going, why are all these people paying fines, but they're not actually making whiskey? Well, apparently they had changed the laws, and because of the taxation, Tennessee distillers said, we can't make whiskey the way we used to make it. So if we can't make it the way we used to make it, we're just not going to make it. And then the government's not going to get their revenues. And then the government starts to sweat. Well, as I'm looking through, I'm going, I don't see Jack Daniel's name in here anywhere. All right. Now, I sort of knew that was coming because the oral tradition says that he started working with Daniel Call, who was a Reverend Daniel Call, and that he worked on his farm, and Nearest Green was the distiller, and one big happy family, and this is how it is. Well, that's how it's written in the legacy book. So you have that, and then what you find is that as I'm going through the records, Daniel and Call, the first time it's actually mentioned is in 1874 or 5. I think it's 5, November of 1875. So this 1866 date, well, that was a very popular date for a lot of distilleries to use, because that was the end of the Civil War. So it only makes sense that you would go, oh, yeah, well, we started in 1866, end of the Civil War. Well, the first problem with oldest registered distillery is that they weren't registering distilleries until 1868. So that was 3 years before, 2 years too early. Second of all, they weren't coming into Tennessee because revenuers were scared to come into Tennessee because it was still a hot zone. And the last thing you wanted to do was go knocking on people's door going, I'm from Washington and I got my hand out. Give me some money. They're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Well, on top of that, I'm finding that Jack Daniel has gone through this thing where he's lost his mother at birth, then he's lost his father during the Civil War, and now he doesn't have, basically he's got some brothers, but one brother was killed in the war as well. And so the family is in turmoil because the father has died, he's being raised by two step-parents. And now there's a fight for the family fortune because Callaway Daniel, his father, had some money. And so you have this situation where this is in limbo until the 1870s. And once it comes out of limbo, Then all of a sudden, Jack Daniel has money. And what can he do with money? But he can join Dan Call in this distillery that he's going to get in. And Dan Call got out of the business like they said he did. The timing wasn't right, though. It was just a year later in 1875. Yes, it was 74, 75. And he basically rented his farm out to Jack to continue on distilling. So oral tradition was right to a point. And that's where oral tradition is handy, because I can read it and I can sort of come in and figure it out, using that as, okay, let me disprove or prove all the way through. But the registered distillery story gets even more curious as you start going through old newspapers, because in a small little Lawrenceburg newspaper in Tennessee, there was an advertisement for Jack Daniel's whiskey in 1792 or 3, something like that. And it says something to the government in Washington shows that Jack Daniel's is the longest running whiskey, or something to that effect. Okay, in the United States. Now, if you just stumbled into that ad, you would go, oh, see, there's the proof. It's right there. I mean, obviously it's proof. Marketers wouldn't lie to you. They wouldn't lie to you in the newspaper. Well, they really probably weren't lying, because the reality was, during that time period, the Internal Revenue was shutting down distilleries left and right for tax stamp issues. And the reason that I know that this is probably the reason they made that claim is 2 years later, a newspaper article comes out in the Nashville Tennessean, or one of the bigger newspapers, where they did a full profile on the Jack Daniel distillery and told, and they were bragging on Lynchburg and all this great stuff about Lynchburg and the Jack Daniel distillery. And at one point in there, they say this is the only distillery that has not been shut down in the United States because of tax stamps. Okay, all right. So now this claim is it's looking like maybe he's got a claim here of some form of being oldest or longest running or whatever it may be. Until me, sleuth that I am, continues looking for Jack Daniel's name further on down the road. Well, come to find out, newspapers sometimes let the cat out of the bag, and the Internal Revenue doesn't like getting a bad image. So somebody all of a sudden was on Jack Daniel's tail, and next thing you know, Jack Daniel's is being shut down because of tax stamps. So it did get shut down, and then after that, you start seeing oldest registered distillery. So it was a good story. They didn't want to let go of it.
Right.
And so the story just morphed into something else.
Yeah.
And then, to help bolster their argument in current marketing, what is the DSP number for Jack Daniels? DSP TN1. And you go, oh, well, they must be the oldest one because they are number one.
Number one,
well,
yeah.
Well, the problem is that Tennessee didn't get back into distilling until 1938. So they were the first Tennessee distiller. I hate to tell them this, but their rival down the road, and they'll say they're not a rival, but I'm sorry, they're owned by Diageo. So, Diageo is a competitor with Johnny Walker to Jack Daniels in the international market. So there is a rivalry there, whether George Dickel is big or not. Dickel was actually being made as a Kentucky bourbon or as a Kentucky whiskey at the very beginning at the end of Prohibition, and it was being made at the Bernheim distillery. Well, if you know about Heaven Hill and their great fire that they had in 1997, they lost their distillery in Bardstown. So what did they do? They bought the Bernheim distillery. Bernheim distillery is DSP KY number one. They were the first ones to produce whiskey in Kentucky after Prohibition. So the reality is, if you want to play the number one game, well, they got you by 5 years in Kentucky with George Dickel. So George Dickel can hang that one in their hat, even though it wasn't a Tennessee whiskey at the time.
Oh man, that's a lot of information, but that's awesome. That's exactly what I wanted, and I knew that's what we were going to get into. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was, because you said it to me, Tennessee whiskey is bourbon, correct or false?
So here's my issue with that statement. Tennessee whiskey was not defined until 2013.
Okay.
So what was Tennessee whiskey before that? I mean, we could say that all Tennessee whiskey was Jack Daniels, because Jack Daniels would love you to believe that.
Right.
Or that it was all George Dickel or all. But see, this is the problem. Tennessee's biggest issue was the fact that they went into Prohibition early as a whiskey producing state. They were the earliest, next to North Carolina. A lot of people don't know North Carolina was huge in distilling prior to Prohibition. So that's another lost story that needs to come about. But Tennessee went shortly after they went into Prohibition. And so if you think about it, they stopped distilling in 1909. They didn't start distilling again until 1938. That is almost 30 years.
Whew. That
is a long gap. So I like to say, when George Dickel came back in 1963 and hit the shelves in 1963, think about somebody who drank George Dickel Cascade whiskey in 1909 when it was brand new. How old are they now in 1963? Because they had to be legal drinking age to drink it in 1909.
Right.
So we're talking about people who are 2 steps away from the grave. Mm-hmm. How are they actually going to relay to the younger crowd, the history of George Dickel? It's just a whiskey that they knew that disappeared, and that because nobody took the time to dig in and learn the actual history of Tennessee whiskey, in 2013 they decided to punt. And what did they do? They said, oh, well, I mean, we'll just take Jack Daniels' method of making whiskey, which I will fully admit is making bourbon and putting it through a charcoal mellowing process. Although, difference being that in Kentucky, usually they will charcoal mellow after it comes out of the barrel, whereas in Tennessee, they do it before it comes out of the barrel. And there's a good reason for that. Good reason in Tennessee for that, which was that prior to Prohibition, if the whiskey had color, from what I'm reading, it was not considered Tennessee whiskey. So that tells a whole different story in terms of what we would think Tennessee whiskey is. So to say that Tennessee whiskey is bourbon is to basically say the state of Tennessee doesn't matter. It's all about a county in Kentucky. And that's it. It discounts the entire history of Tennessee whiskey. And what it does is it creates a situation where you get these history writers for American whiskey history who will write the history of bourbon and who will ignore that Tennessee exists beyond the fact that there was a George Dickel, and they'll give them that. Yeah, you got George Dickel and you got Jack Daniel, but there really wasn't much going on. They were making something down there. The difference between Kentucky distilling pre-Prohibition and Tennessee is that Tennessee got out of the chute a lot faster. So in the days of the farmer distiller, Tennessee was blowing the doors off of Kentucky because they had a head start. They had a whiskey tycoon named Frederick Stump, who basically was running Nashville with whiskey in the 1790s and early 1800s. Kentucky was still trying to get their sea legs at that point. I mean, we're talking 1789 if you want to believe the whole Elijah Craig thing, which he was making whiskey, but not necessarily putting it in casks. But they had a really good long head start. In fact, Daniel Boone, I found records in the Shelby family papers that show that Daniel Boone was bartering rum with Evan Shelby in 1773. And so that means they're already producing rum in Tennessee in 1773. And 7 years later, there's an order for rye whiskey that Evan Shelby asks his distiller to make. So they had a massive head start. Tennessee was a very big agricultural state. And and it had a very diverse landscape. So, it's split up into 3 sections, and really the West never got heavy into distilling. It was more cotton area, but the middle and East, a lot of whiskey was being made in those areas. And but what happened was industrialization hit Kentucky before it hit Tennessee. And Tennesseans did not want to give up their old-fashioned ways. They were very much to tradition, and there were famous battles between Lincoln County and Robertson County as to, you're making sweet mash whiskey, which back then the terms were different. Sweet mash whiskey back then meant you were using yeast or some kind of chemical stimulation to get your mash working. Sour mash meant you were basically sitting there putting a little backset in and waiting for natural fermentation to take hold. You could not add anything to it. If you did, that was considered sweet mash. And so you'd have these arguments going on back and forth. So they took it very seriously back then. But because Tennessee wanted to stay with traditional sour mash, or that they were tied to tradition, only a handful of distillers, one being John Speary's Bell Mead, and another being Charles Nelson's Greenbrier, they got big. But most of the other ones stayed small. Jack Daniel famously said, I have not found this quote, so don't quote me on this, but they tell you this at the distillery, so you know how far you might be able to take this. Right. But that Jack did 99 bushels. He would not do 100 bushels because he didn't want another revenuer on site. And that was it. So, and it was Lem Motlow, his nephew, that drove him to finally open up and start distilling more because they're winning awards. He didn't even want to win awards. He's like, I don't want my whiskey to be too popular, right? Because I don't want to have to get that extra revenuer on site. So, yeah. It's very, I mean, that's why I say the stories around Jack Daniels are great. And I do like the fairy tale ones as well, because they say a lot about what was interesting to them at that time period, what they valued. Right. So there's some plus to that. I don't think modern fairy tales, though, tend to tell as much about us. They do, but I think back then, because we have so little information on these people, that it's kind of an insight into their psychological way of thinking. Right. So.
Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, I'm gonna caveat right here at the end, I guess. So, what do you think of this Jack 10?
This is actually, I've had batch 2, 3, and 4.
Okay.
In the past. I don't remember how it worked out. It seems like 12 and 10 always seem to be going back and forth for me.
Yes.
It's like I like it one year, I like one, the next year I like the other. And I was surprised the first year because I think that was batch 1 of 12. I loved it, but I didn't really warm to the 10. Then the next year I liked the 10, but I didn't warm to the 12. I got to say, this year's 10, 12, and 14, I'm supposed to do a review on these. I can't do it. I cannot tell much of a difference between the 3.
Really? Other than proof, right? I think the 14. Yeah, the 14 is higher, but
yeah. And so I feel like part of it is that maybe I'm just fatiguing on older whiskeys, because I don't usually tend to like stuff that starts getting very oaky, but I will say Chris Fletcher does a nice job of usually keeping it from going overboard. I still don't know how they're going to do an 18-year-old, or I think they said they were going to do a 21-year-old.
Yeah, I've heard that too. So I
bury it underground.
Yeah, I mean, unless they do like slow water reduction or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean, to me, coming off, I've had other Jack Daniel's products lately. Their single barrel proof rye whiskey is really good. I was able to get a sample of the 12 as well. I don't remember which batch it was. And I thought, well, that's okay. It's not great. But like this one to me, just coming off, and of course, this is the only drink I've had for a minute. But like, I don't know. It's not giving me those typical banana runts type notes on it. It to me, it's really, it's subtle in its nose, but it's really, it has a lot of like brown sugar, which normally I would get like a real high cherry note, which I'm hoping that maybe this is just a good batch.
The thing that stands out on this one for me is on the finish, I'm left with this kind of Raisinets chocolate, which is really interesting. And you kind of have to wait till your palate starts to dry out a little bit. But it's like, it's not necessarily the raisin, it's that milk chocolate that comes with that just kind of lays on the palate at the end. And I like that.
Okay.
The nose is somewhat sweet on it. As you say, kind of brown sugary note. I mean, it does have somewhat traditional Jack Daniel's kind of notes to it, but it's not heavy on the banana nut bread for sure.
No, it's not. It's not.
But I do maybe detect a little bit of that banana note again with that Raisinets note that's coming on at the end.
You know, now that you're saying it, and it might be subjective because, that's how taste is, right? I'm getting what you're talking about. Like like when I don't know how they make chocolate, shelf stable because it should melt and all the things, right? So there's a byproduct in the chocolate that makes it not melt. And I don't know if that's kind of like, it's almost like a waxy, I hate to say that word, but it's almost waxy, to where it's like almost coating your tongue a little bit with that waxy chocolatey note, but it's almost like cocoa, like waxy cocoa. It's a very strange note, but I do, now that saying it, do get a little bit of the breadiness from the banana bread, like the sweetness that's coming through. I don't eat bananas a lot, so that's kind of my it's a crux of mine. I just don't like them, I don't know, something about them. But anyway, all right, so where was I going from there? We tried the whiskey. Now we're moving on. Okay. So tell us a little bit about, okay, we got through to the Tennessee. Okay. No, I realized it just hit me. Okay. So I was talking to my wife. She is not a whiskey person. She is not a history person. So just understand that. She's making dinner and I'm telling her, you're coming on here and we're going to talk about, some nerdy stuff that she could care less about. And I said something about the Shelby family. Okay. And she goes, oh, like from Peaky Blinders. So I'm going to ask the question that maybe you had before. Is there any correlation? And I know Peaky Blinders is a false, it's a fictional thing, but there obviously is a little bit of truth there because they were running whiskey in Ireland and all the things. And a lot of the people that came to Tennessee were Scotch Irish. Could there be a correlation between the Peaky Blinders people and the Shelby family?
Probably not, because the Shelby family was Welsh.
Oh,
yes.
Well, that didn't help me.
Yeah.
Wow. See, man,
sorry,
you blew my
bubble.
Yeah, you blew my bubble up.
I mean, just thought it's a small island. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. No, I thought it funny that my wife chimed in on that part. So, because she loves the whole Peaky Blinders series. But
know what she's done though is what I do sometimes in my history research, which is my ears perk up when I hear something familiar. Right. And that is a great way to stop someone and say, wait a second, does that relate to this? Because you'd be surprised at how many times somebody is holding on to a story that you are trying to find the answer to, or that you find a connection you never, ever would have thought existed.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, it's like the question not asked is never answered, right? So it's one of those things. If you don't ask the question, you never know. But at the same time, I will tell you that I don't know how well this little book club thing is going to go. I don't know how well received it's going to be, because I've had quite a few people on my channel reach back to me and say, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun. But at the same time, that means people, and this will be this world. People have to pick up a book or listen to an Audible, but yet they'll sit there and listen to a podcast, but they won't listen to a couple hours of a, you know, of an Audible or something like that. So it's getting people outside to come inside. Have you noticed in the since there's been a uptick in podcasting and all these things, have you noticed a decline in book sales?
It's hard to say because I mean, I released my first book in May of 2020. So, I mean, I was right in the pandemic
and right in the middle of it. Yeah, exactly.
So it's hard to know and gauge what was going on before that. I will say that books still outsell audiobooks.
Really?
So
okay.
Yeah, there's more people buying, but you know, more people are probably going to pick up my travel books in paperback because you can carry it with you and you can flip it open anytime you want to. I have a website with all the information on it. People don't go to the website quite as much as they go to the book. And that's just because you can pick it up, look at it real quickly, but then when it's not around, and you got the website to go back and check out and see what's in there. So the problem with the book is that you can, you know, for me as a writer, it's like it takes a long time to write one. So you're not going to get a lot of stuff. If I was doing podcasts, I would be putting out one a week and people would be very happy with me, but I would also be pulling my hair out because that is a lot of research. And then I'd feel really bad because I wasn't giving the true full story because nobody can research all that stuff in such a short period of time. So I mean, and it's funny because people will also ask me, you know, who I like in terms of podcasting and that sort of thing. And I'm always like, man, I wish I could listen to podcasts, but I've always got my head buried in websites, research and books that I'm looking through for footnotes and whatever else I can find. So it's rare that I get to actually just sit back and relax and enjoy a conversation.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm so appreciative of you coming on here and hanging out with me. And guys, just to let you give a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here, you know, I reached out to Drew a while back and he said, hey, I can do it this week. Let's go. You know, like it's one of those things where like, I understand you're a busy man and I don't want to take a lot of your time at the same time, because I know you have other things to do and you have life. But one of the other questions that I wanted to ask you about book writing in general is, do you, and I know you do, and this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, but how do you get past that writer's block to where you're just like, man, I'm not making any progress with this? How do you get past that? Is there a special thing you do, or
you do in some ways? You know, I always feel like the start of the chapter is always the hardest thing to do. If you can get the first few words down, then you're fine. But you know, when I do my podcasts nowadays, I don't do an intro anymore. I just start chatting with people. And I think the easiest way to get past writer's block, first of all, is to have content. So you need to know what you're going to be writing about. Well, if you know what you're writing about, the second thing that usually gets in the way of you being able to write is that you're thinking of something else that you are not doing because you're not writing. So it's distracting you and it's keeping you. So you also need to set aside time. I tend to write early in the morning because and when I say early, I will start getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and start writing because I'm fresh. I don't have any conflict in my brain. I am just there to write and I can go. So that can help. Start in the middle of a chapter if you have to start in the middle of a chapter, and don't be afraid to rewrite, because I always say the best way for me to get started is to know that my first copy is a rough draft, and I'm a perfectionist and it's very hard for me to do that. But I will, and what I'll find is that I will start writing with that in mind, and then suddenly I'm like writing like it's the end of my life if I don't get this exactly right. And I have to give myself permission to relax a little bit and enjoy the writing process and create. Because one of the things is that I do in terms of writing is I don't just write the story. You probably picked up in a couple of places in this book where I'll start on something different that's unrelated, and then I'll turn it around and be into the subject. And you're like, what was that about?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's like the Selu chapter at the beginning, where I'm basically we're talking about a Cherokee story, and you're going, why is he telling me a Cherokee story?
Right.
Well, I had to set up where corn came from, because nobody's ever written the story of where corn came from. But that doesn't just come out of nowhere. That's like, you have to look at your chapter and say, am I going to start this chapter the same way that I've started every other chapter, which is Evan Shelby was born in Tregarden, Wales in 17 blah blah blah, and his family came to blah blah blah. And do people really want to read that over and over and over again? Or would they rather maybe start off by going, a large piece of property was sold in Pennsylvania? Who knew that this guy would be somehow the first distiller in Tennessee? You know, that gets people engaged. And so I think sometimes it helps in getting a chapter started in saying, I do not have permission to start this chapter like I've started every other one. It's got to start from somewhere else. And nowhere is that more true than in my Whiskey Lore Volume 1. And I call it Whiskey Lore Volume 1 because I was going to write a book called 101 Whiskey Myths, and then I was going to go through and debunk them. But I found that after writing 24 of them, I already had a 250-page book. So I needed to, nobody was going to pick up a book, you know, here you can use it, hit somebody over the head with it, and it's a murder weapon. But those stories, you know, you'll start off, when I do Master Distiller and I tell the origins of Master Distiller, I'm like, I could start like every other whiskey book and basically say, okay, well, here's what I found, blah, 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 back in such and such day. But that creates no mystery in the chapter.
Right.
So the way I start that chapter off is by talking about Johann Sebastian Bach. And I'm saying, and I'm learning a lot actually too, because as I was digging in, trying to learn the story of Johann Sebastian Bach, the question was in my head, why was this guy such a master of music? What was it that made him so? Because I've listened to his music my whole life, but I could not tell you exactly what it was that made him a master. And what made him a master was the fact that basically before then you couldn't play more than an octave, because if you went beyond that octave, because of actual tuning, firm tuning, the way it is, the notes do not match up. An E doesn't match an E in the next octave. It's off by a certain amount in the frequency. So he created what was called equal temperament, which was there's an equal distance between each of these. They are not natural this way, but I'm going to make them work because they sound okay. And then this way you can move to further octaves. And I said, this is a master. This is somebody whose work was so important that everyone that followed him has benefited from what he did in that moment. And then you look at some guy who got some money together, bought a pot still, stuck it up in his trailer, and he's making some whiskey, and he's got a business card and it says Master Distiller on it. And you go, Master, what does that mean? What does that even mean? And so before I could tell the story of Master Distiller in whiskey, I had to tell the story of the evolution of mastery. And when did mastery go from what was Johann Sebastian Bach into why do we have doctorates? You know, if mastery is mastery, why do we need a doctorate? Where did that come from? And then into how once it became finishing something or getting to the completion and having knowledge of something, that became, oh, well, I mastered the English language. Okay, that's great. A lot of people have mastered the English language. What makes you so special? Right? So I needed to get that understanding of the evolution of the word first to be able to write the story and to put it in context for you. And I'm as much of a history fan as I am a whiskey history fan. So you're gonna get, you know, a baseball game at the beginning of a chapter on America's native spirit, and you'll go, why is he doing a baseball game? It all comes clear because I tie something with the man who was pitching the ball game and the man who coined the term America's native spirit. So, and it just makes reading, I think, a lot more interesting for the reader. And so you really got to set those up ahead of time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, because a master is just that. I've heard other people say it takes 10,000 hours. But I don't think there's a timeline on it. I think when you have perfected whatever craft you're in, it doesn't matter if you're distilling whiskey or being a composer, when you have perfected, and by perfection, I mean, there's always for change, because perfection, you're not going to reach perfection, because perfection is, I don't say it's unattainable, but it's also, there's always room for improvement in everything that you do, because if you're not improving, you're not really perfecting yourself as well. So like me, for instance, and not to bring myself into this, I am what they would consider a master plumber, right? I've put 25 years of my life into the trade. I know a thing or two, let's just say, but do I know everything? Absolutely not. Can I give you a schematic drawing on a 85-story building? Probably not. I mean, I could, but probably not very easily, and it's going to look not well. But can I diagnose a problem and fix the problem? Yes. So, I mean, there's mastery in itself is just knowing the craft that you're in and knowing that thing, but also being able to take advice and take that understanding from other people who might see it from a different vantage point, take that and run with it. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, the reason that it came up in my mind was because I had been calling a lot of people master distiller, and sometimes it was just a default title if I was talking to a distiller who was in charge. But then I was in Scotland and everybody's a head distiller, or a production director. They weren't necessarily using the term master as much. And then I interviewed Richard Patterson, who's a 50-year master blender. And I asked him, I said, when did you start calling yourself master? And do you feel like that term is overused? And he said, yes, he felt that the term was overused. And you know what? Coming from somebody who is such a Scotch whiskey ambassador and somebody who has been doing this for so long, I have no issue calling him a master distiller.
Absolutely.
It was interesting because I asked, getting back to a Tennessee theme, I asked Chris Fletcher, his grandfather, Frank Bobo, ran Jack Daniels during many of the years it was in allocation. And I asked him, did he call himself a master distiller? No, I don't think he ever called himself that. And that makes sense, because back then, we didn't glorify people the way we did now in the whiskey trade.
Right.
It was probably much more internal rather than it was. And that's why those early mentions that I found in newspapers saying he's Kentucky's he's the master distiller of Kentucky. He's a master distiller of Kentucky. Well, that's saying he is one of the greats in Kentucky right now. Right. Yeah. He has a mastery about what he does. Right. And I think that's a good line of delineation between the two, is mastery versus a master. Because a master to me is Johann Sebastian Bach. If everybody else is learning from what you did, now it could be on a smaller scale. If everybody in your organization, you may be the master distiller of your organization because everybody in your organization is learning a particular thing that nobody else is doing, that you're doing at this particular distillery that you have mastered. And maybe that makes you stand out. I don't know. I mean, it can get very heavy into semantics and sometimes I go, you're taking this too seriously, but there's another part of me that goes, no, but I really want to know, where did this come from? Why are people doing this? I don't understand why I can't find the first mention of female master distiller until 2014. That just doesn't seem right to me.
It doesn't.
So, yeah,
it doesn't. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And in the end, it's just a name, right? It's just a title. It's not. I know people that like my wife's grandfather, he was a master of living, you know what I mean? Because he had done life and he knows the rights, the wrongs, the things to do. And he always had, I think mastery is wisdom, right? It's having that wisdom of being like, I've done the things. Don't do this, do this. That's it. And it's kind of simple when you put it in that perspective. But when you're talking about a specific craft like distilling, there are, guidelines to follow. There's things to do. But at the end of the day, it's your product. You're making it. It's up to you. It's what you're doing. Is Jimmy Russell any better of a distiller than someone else? No, but he just has mastered his section of the distillery, and people look at that and they're like, oh, his wisdom, and he's like, no, I just am attuned, and you become acquainted with the surroundings you're in, and you're like the smell, taste, touch, all your senses, and the next thing you do, and it's almost a spiritual thing, both physically you're making spirits and mentally, you become in one with the still and making the product and doing all that. It becomes a thing, and you're able to understand that. And that's why some of these people make absolutely fantastic products. And whereas others are struggling because they're just trying to get that mastery part down. And I feel like, and I'll be the first to say this, I'm a Texas boy. I'm certified Texas whiskey right there on my thing. We have a long way to go in Texas. Like we make some great products, yes, but there's a lot of room for improvement there. And the thing is, we are such a new brand that it just takes time. We don't have mastery of anything as of right now, I feel. There's some, like I said, there's people doing amazing stuff. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like in the next 20 years, we're going to get into some mastery of that. Nancy Fraley's been working a lot with a lot of the Texas distilleries trying to get their brands, but it's not all about blending, right? It's not all about blending the product. It has to be good product coming off as well. And it has to be marketed well. It has to be, all of the things have to line up for the company and the brand to succeed. And I want to applaud all the ones that have done it before. But what also happens, and we can talk about this for a second, is when a company does get its wings and starts soaring, other companies look at that and they're like, hey, that would look good under our portfolio, and then you get people like, not to say anything, but like Brown-Forman and, Diageo, they want to come in. And now a lot of times they don't hinder the production or they don't mess with anything going on. They just give more monetary backing. But it does, to me, and I'll say this, and this is just my opinion, it doesn't have to be yours, it does kind of make me feel a certain way when a product is now, I don't want to say a mass-produced product, but like I love the whole craftiness of these craft distilleries and the fact that my granddad did this, and he's still doing it, and the legacy still goes on, but now it has a $2 billion backing instead of like, we need to get this barrel out because we need to make bills, that type of thing. Like, and I don't want for any distillery to fail, because obviously when whiskey does well, you and I both do well. Right. So that's part of the thing. But like, also like, I don't want it to be a monopolized system, as well. I know, I don't think it will be anytime soon, because there's a bunch of craft distilleries popping up, and you're a forefront of going to these craft distilleries. I've seen some of the places that you've gone. I haven't even heard of these distilleries, so I need to.
That's why I go.
Exactly. Like you've been in what, New Jersey and places like that.
I've been doing a lot in Pennsylvania here recently.
Pennsylvania,
yeah. I'm trying to hit all 48 lower contiguous states this year, and
sweet.
I think I'm going to be able to do it. One craft distillery. It has to be a craft distillery. It has to be owned by. I went to West Virginia. I'm like, I cannot go to Smooth Ambler because they are now owned by Bacardi, I think it is, or whoever owns them. And it's hard for me because when I first got into Tennessee whiskey, one of my favorite distilleries was Nelson Greenbrier.
Yep.
Love Nelson Greenbrier. I love talking to Charlie and Andy, and I just recently started chatting with Charlie on something, and it's like these brothers learning their family's lost history,
Yep.
and building that thing, and their story of being 22-year-olds, and how do you go to a bank and ask for money, and these are all great things that bind you to a brand. And when you see that label, and then you find out that Constellation Brands has bought them out and that they're now running the show, I have to say that I don't have the same warm fuzzy about Nelson's Greenbrier that I used to. And maybe that's not fair. I don't know that the whiskey really has changed. The thing is that there is a certain sense of urgency, I think, and also a sense of legacy when the people who built the brand are still running the brand. Now, there are people who have gotten into this business as craft distillers that saw dollar signs, and they really weren't thinking the craft as much as they were thinking, this is big, I can make a lot of money doing this right now. And so you are going to have, this is not to say that craft distillers are all virtuous. There's also craft distillers who will just continually struggle, or that will lose their passion as they're going on, and they mail it in every day.
Yeah.
We're human beings. We're all going to do that. So it's really hard to just paint a broad brush with broad strokes and say, all corporate owned. I still drink Blue Moon beer every once in a while, and it's still good. I mean, I don't have a problem with it, but I will say that when I lived in Asheville, North Carolina, or just south of Asheville, North Carolina, it was fighting for Beer City, USA, and getting it every other year. And we had a brewery there called Wicked Weed. And, it was a very popular spot with the locals, everybody. And then InBev came in, bought it. The locals won't touch it. They have no interest in it whatsoever. Now, has their beer changed? Probably not. They're still packing people in. It's just they're all tourists. They're not locals. Locals don't go to Wicked Weed. So I've seen it in the beer industry, but I've also seen that those survive with the cash backing. Sometimes they don't get touched. This is one of the things I will say about Diageo. As big as a conglomerate as Diageo is, I've been to a lot of their distilleries in Scotland, and except for the fact that they're gutting their visitor centers and making them ultra modern, which I hate, the rest of what they're doing in terms of preserving the whiskeys that are being made there is brilliant, because if you're going to just be Diageo and you're going to make everything taste like Johnny Walker, then why do I even need to pay attention to these different distilleries? It is what each of those is doing independently that actually is bringing diversity to the blenders who are making Johnny Walker out of all of this different spirit. So, I can't put a big negative on conglomerates coming in and buying up these distilleries either, because some of them will be hands off, and I can appreciate that. But I do want to find, this is what I'm doing through Instagram and my bracketology and fan favorite craft distillery of the year thing. I want to draw out fans of particular brands that are of craft distilleries I've never heard of, because as you were surprised by some of the names of places that I've gone, I was just as surprised when I posted their name up when I asked for nominations for Wisconsin distilleries, and I got a barrage of distilleries. I'm like, I didn't even know there were distilleries in Wisconsin. And now I see that there are a ton of them, and they are all universally loved.
Yes.
And where did this come from?
Right.
And then I'm from Michigan originally, and so I didn't think, Michigan has no distilling history beyond industrial distilling. So all of a sudden to find out that there are distilleries spread all across the state of Michigan, and that Michigan is making some of the most interesting whiskeys around, and you're going, where did this come from? And it's kind of like digging into history for me. When I discover something that I don't know, and that I am that leads me to curiosity, that why doesn't anybody else know this either, it makes me want to really dive in deep. And so I mean, the book that I'm working on after, because I just released Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, but I am working on a book called Experiencing American Whiskey. And I am going to endeavor to reach out to every single craft distillery in the United States that makes whiskey to ask them about what they're making and at least make a connection with them, and then get them more exposure if I can do so, because I love the craft distilleries I've gone to visit. The problem is that writing a full featured Experiencing American Whiskey the same way I write the Kentucky Bourbon one, where I do 2-page profiles of every distillery. I'm sorry, with over 1,000 distilleries, 2 pages each, that's a 2,000 page book. On top of, I'd like to give you some advice for when you're doing these trips and how to do them, and maybe do some feature stories in them as well. But I'm finding a way to get the names in there at least anyway. So, but I really want to connect to a lot of these distilleries. And I want people, when they're traveling to Rhode Island and they think, I didn't even think about, I wonder if there's a distillery around. Yeah, there's like 6 that you could go to that are all making whiskey in a little Rhode Island.
Right.
So, I mean, it's there. And the hard part for the small craft distillers, and another reason I focus on them, is because in a way, they can do Facebook ads, they can do whatever they want to do to try to market. But man, it is really hard to reach people. And I would like to be a catalyst to help those brands, especially the ones that are doing some really interesting whiskeys, get an amplifier, even for a moment, even if they only make it through one round of my competition. That was enough for somebody to see the name and go, oh, I didn't know who that was, and I've seen their bottle now, and I know that there's a distillery in Alaska, in North Pole, Alaska, that's, an estate distillery, and you're going, an estate distillery, what are they growing in Alaska?
Right.
Well, that there is a story, and I'm sure people would love to hear it. So, keep the door open to these things, but that's a lot of it, is amplification and really trying to get people to know that, especially overseas, because when I go overseas, they're like, well, there's Jack Daniels and Jim Beam, but American whiskey isn't that great. I'm going, but there's more than that.
A lot more.
There's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And that's one of the things I try to showcase on my show as well, is these, now, I don't want to say smaller, because some of them are bigger, I guess. I don't know, like whoever will answer, obviously, but it's one of these things. I get people that have, it's 100-gallon still or 100,000 gallon still. It doesn't matter. But are you doing something cool? Are you doing something a little bit different? Because you have to, in the whiskey community, unfortunately, you have to differentiate yourself from somebody else. You can't make your granddad's whiskey over and over again. There's already people doing that. So do something a little bit different. That's why I love talking to people like JT Mellick making rice whiskey, or Still Austin out of Texas. Obviously, they're doing Texas whiskey. So it's like talking to all these different brands doing different things. I had a really cool distillery out of Indiana. They have a 125-gallon pot still that they're working on, and they're creating some really amazing whiskey. Well, it's not, most of it's not even whiskey. It's a rye whiskey mixed with cane sugar. So like a true moonshine, and it's fantastic. Like, so just the things that they're doing, really, really amazing. And I want to showcase that. Like you said, even if it's just for a split second, they get an extra like on something, or maybe they get a follow on Instagram or something. And I know you do as well. I just want to amplify these people as much as possible. Okay, I got one last question before I got to let you go. So, being a whiskey nerd, which I know you are, and I know you've been pretty well versed in the whiskey world, not only with American whiskey and bourbons and Tennessee whiskeys. I'll call it Tennessee whiskey now. Not only those, but the world whiskeys. What whiskey right now, other than the one we were partaking tonight, what whiskey right now are you really jiving on? What is a whiskey that you're just like, man, that thing's, every time I pick it up, I am blown away by it?
Well, I will tell you that I do like peated whiskey.
Amen. Love you, brother.
It's one of those things where once you find Pete and you discover Pete and Pete becomes your friend, it stays your friend. So when I was doing my travels up, and I've tasted some really great whiskeys from around a lot of different craft distilleries, but on my middle Atlantic trip, when I went to Virginia and Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, I was actually went to go talk to another podcaster, and we were in a conversation, and he just kind of focuses on that mid-Atlantic area. He had a lot of bottles that were local, and one of the whiskeys that he pulled out was one that I had seen actually on Instagram, and I saw that they were building a new distillery, and it was the only reason why I didn't come visit them. I believe it's Malarkey or Merlark. I think it's just Malarkey is how they probably pronounce it. It is out of Virginia. It's near Manassas, Virginia. It is I'm going to forget what the name of it is now. It's a black label. It is a peated whiskey, and it's just got an addictive kind of flavor to it me, because it doesn't taste like anything else that I've tasted before. And that has really grabbed me. And I will tell you a second, because it is a tie. And people may not think of peated whiskey as coming from Atlanta, but ASW's Tire Fire, I could just run through a bottle of that stuff. It is easy to drink. It has got a wonderful flavor to it. They distill off of a pot still, which I do appreciate. And even in that Atlanta heat, I actually put my name, Whiskey Lore, on an ASW whiskey. That was the first barrel pick I ever did.
Wow.
And it was on a whiskey called Red X, which was a special release that they did that Justin let me smell the whiskey in the barrel, and it was like, I know that smell. And I said, but I can't put my finger out. And he said, Fruit Loops. And I went, yes, that's what it is. It's Fruit Loops. And so I was like, yeah, if we're going to put my name on something, let's put my name on that one, because that's something special. So, but Tire Fire, I mean, the name makes you go, really? I mean, that's just going to smell like rubber. What is that? No, it's, it is a really excellent smoky whiskey, and one that definitely will be staying in my cabinet.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talking about that one, the Tire Fire. The other one, obviously, I haven't heard of, but it sounds very intriguing, and I'm all about a good craft whiskey doing some cool stuff. So, yeah. Okay, Drew, before I let you go, what do you want to plug? Obviously, you have your new revised book that you came out with. What else is going on there, and any socials you want to plug?
Sure. Well, the easiest thing to do is just to go to whiskey-lore.com. There you'll find, you can go to whiskey-lore.com/books, and all of my books are listed there. Or if you go to whiskey-lore.com/travel, you'll find all the distillery profiles that I've done. There's over 1,000 of them in there now, around the world, with maps and details. So if you're travel planning, it lets you sign up for a membership, and you can tag the ones that you want to keep in your wish list until you go through and you start your trip planning, and then the booking links are right there, and you can click on them as you're choosing your. So I want to try to make it as easy as possible. This is all on the. This is all while I'm also releasing the Experience in Kentucky Bourbon 2nd edition. So I can't stress enough. Unfortunately, Amazon is not taking down the 1st edition. So I would not buy that one, even though it's cheaper, because it's also 100 pages less, and it's 100 pages less, and it is 5 years out of date. So there's a lot of missing distilleries, and one distillery that disappeared. Unfortunately, it's still there, but you can't tour it anymore. So so that's good. But books, I still do the podcast Whiskey Flights. Whiskey Flights is me talking to small craft distilleries. This is what I call my Great 48 tour, where I'm going to distilleries around, but I'm also focusing on Kentucky for couple of weeks while this new book is out. So lots of stuff, but you can find everything that I'm doing. Just go to whiskey-lore.com, and social media links are all there. I'm probably most active on Instagram. So that's
awesome.
To get.
Awesome.
Yep.
Drew, I cannot thank you enough. I don't know about you, but I feel there could possibly be another episode coming, because we barely scratched the surface on this book, let alone the 10,000 other books. Do you sleep? Like, good Lord, do you?
I try to. No, I mean, I do stay pretty busy. I am a one-man wrecking machine. I don't really, in fact, this last book, I did the cover. I did I actually used, rather than having an editor this time, I had AI just tell me what my spelling issues were, and any egregious grammatical errors. But beyond that, the cover, everything is basically me. So sometimes I think maybe I need to take a break, but then I go, my break is I get to go visit distilleries, and that is my all around the country, and that is my break. It's Absolutely. A change of scenery away from my desk. So.
No, I get it. Well, I will tell all of the listeners out there and the viewers, whoever it is, I'm picking up that new bourbon one. So just be aware of that. We might have a book club part 2 as well. So y'all just get ready for that. Drew, again, I can't thank you enough for hanging out with me. I know your time is precious, and I appreciate you coming in and hanging out. But y'all be good. Thank you very much. Stick on real fast. I want to talk to you, obviously. What else? I got new stickers if you want one. Y'all need Jesus, not Jack and Jim. And I got Glencairns, all the things. I'm grifting at this point. Y'all be good. And until next time, keep your spirits up. Peace out.